I said this the other day in a TV appearance. Like, it used to be, when I got into politics, it was Republicans and conservatives are for lower taxes, less government, social things like standing up for life, and Democrats with the opposite. And now they're for like standing up for illegals' rights, lawfare, and whatever. But Josh, it's funny. You said something to me a second ago that kind of brought everything together. Because what I've invoked this before. When I served in Trump 1, I was a member of the Board of Visitors at the U.S. Naval Academy. Biden fired me. We went to court, Spicer v. Biden, and we made the administration argue in the affirmative that the president had the right to fire everyone. And everyone at the time said, oh, you guys lost your case. And Stephen Miller and all the folks in America First Legal kind of chuckled and went, did we?
Yeah, right.
And then, so fast forward, Trump wins again and then fires the Biden appointees, and they all get their, upset and start clutching their pearls, as you were saying a moment ago, and, all screaming to the press. And then a week ago, Trump fires everyone from the Holocaust Board, including Doug Emhoff, and then the 2 now New York Times stories. Another one came out last week. Holocaust Museum board member condemns silence on Trump firings. New York Times, nowhere in the story do they mention, and again, I don't mean to sound like a sixth grader here, but you started it. The Biden administration, for the first time, and they write in this story about the Holocaust, they're like, never before has a political appointee been removed from the board. And I'm like, right, but Biden did this for the first time ever when he did it on all of the service academies and then others. He removed a guy named Paul Packer from the Holocaust Museum, and no one said a damn thing. And suddenly, Doug Emhoff, the vice president's husband, and all these other board members that were appointed by Biden or Obama are getting upset. And the problem is that this gets back to this. This is where it all ties together, is that they started it. And it wasn't until we fought back that now it's a big thing. And all these New York Times is like, this is unprecedented. No, it's not. You guys, they started it.
No, they have a habit of starting a lot of things that people at the time, sometimes their better angels will tell them, oh, maybe this might come back to bite us in the rear end. But they, Sean, if there's one thing that we know about modern leftists and modern Democrats, they are woefully incapable, it seems, of thinking about the mid to long term. All they seem to care about is the short term. I think back to that somewhat infamous quote from the 20th century liberal economist John Maynard Keynes, who famously said, well, in the long run, we're all dead. Well, that's kind of like that's really kind of the left's mentality, actually, right? I mean, they really are kind of short-term oriented there. You mentioned the filibuster earlier. That's another fantastic example. I mean, when Harry Reid eviscerated the filibuster, he didn't think about the fact that, okay, well, if Republicans win the White House a few years later in 2016, they might have a Supreme Court vacancy there. And then based on that precedent, they might get rid of the filibuster for a SCOTUS. And that's exactly how we got Justice Neil Gorsuch to fill the Antonin Scalia seat there. So, I mean, they just do not think about these things really just whatsoever there. And it is incumbent upon us on the right to teach them a lesson every now and then. And I don't love that that's where we're at. I mean, it does not bring me any joy to say these things. I mean, I love the American. I am a true constitutionalist. I love this Constitution. I love my year clerking for a federal appeals judge. I speak on law school campuses. I do Federal Society talks. I love this stuff. I'm a legal nerd, really, in many ways at heart. So I hate the fact that we're kind of having to talk about all these kind of icky tactics to try to kind of get us back to something remotely resembling normalcy. But I'm also a pragmatist and a realist, and I kind of survey the landscape. I look at where we're at, and I'm just trying to do the best for not just the American right, but frankly for the country as a whole.
I agree. I mean, I think the filibuster is important, right? And it's funny how the left wanted to get rid of it. And now that they're in the minority, Adam Schiff, of all people, the other day was bemoaning attempts to water down the filibuster. I'm like, wait, hold on, time out. Not only did you guys want to get rid of it, which, okay, I mean, technically they have a right to, you called it racist. Right. And now that you're in the minority, it's like we must preserve it until we're in the majority again. And they never think about the long-term consequences of this stuff. But I do want to touch on your legal nerdiness for a second, because there's a question I've been dying to ask you. Since we found out that you're coming back, because you're the perfect person to answer this question to. There is this refrain in the media over and over again about, whether it's the Maryland family man, and the word that keeps coming up the phrase is due process. And I'm not a lawyer. I watch a lot of legal shows. But I want to tap into your prowess here, because the president was asked about this, and a lot of other people, about what the Constitution affords with respect to due process. Now, I, as a layperson, put this into 3 buckets, Josh. I believe the American people, if you are an American citizen, you have due process unequivocally under the Constitution, right? That shouldn't be of any kind of discussion. I believe there's a second bucket, which is if you are in this country legally. So you are a legal visitor through a visa or you come into this country legally through a port of entry and you are here. Then my understanding is you are afforded due process under the Constitution. I do wonder, and this is what I want to touch on you about whether my theory is right, and specifically part 3. If you enter the country illegally, are you then afforded due process? So can you address the whole and then the third piece specifically?
Sure. So this is a very important question, obviously. So when you look at the actual text of the Fifth Amendment's due process clause, it does speak more abstractly about persons. There's no reference to citizens here. Now, a lot of people on the left, a lot of kind of civil libertarians, old school ACLU types, like to dwell on that particular point. The rebuttal that I like to make is that the entire purpose of our Constitution is predicated upon the opening words of the preamble, which speaks of we the people, not we the citizens of the world. This is a constitutional charter of Republican self-governance for we the people of the United States. So that's a very important distinction to make when it comes to talking about the entirety of constitutional rights. To kind of make one very crude analogy here, I'll just briefly talk about the Second Amendment. I as a U.S. citizen, Sean, you as a citizen, we have a right to kind of walk into local gun store. You pass your FBI background check. You're in and out there 30, 60 minutes, whatever it is, to get your gun. I'm a gun owner. I've done this numerous times. If you're here as an alien, illegal, or even legal, you don't have the same ability to just easily walk in and acquire a firearm there. So it really does actually apply differently, not every time, but there are some provisions that meaningfully are different for citizen or alien, and then alien, legal, or illegal aliens. Okay, so let's talk about due process. So,
wait, can I just ask a question because you brought that up? So if I'm a citizen of France and I am visiting the United States and I want to buy a gun, do they have what is that? I'm intrigued now that you brought it up. What do they have a right to purchase a gun? Do they just go through a similar background check, or because they're not a U.S. citizen? Like, how does that? It's fascinating on that example.
So it probably depends on where you live. It would be an issue of both state law and federal law, because there's not a whole lot of federal case law on this exact point. But the long story short is that it would be a lot more difficult. You would likely need to overcome some sort of presumption against you acquiring it. Now, if you're a citizen who's here on a green card, you're working like a dangerous shift in an overnight facility, you could probably kind of overcome that to your local sheriff or something there. But it would take a lot more work, is the point, than just a U.S. citizen kind of walking in there with your passport, driver's license, going through a check or whatnot there. But when it comes to the whole due process conversation here is how it essentially works. The ability to exclude, the ability to keep out, is the defining feature of what it means to be a sovereign power. People have been saying this for literally hundreds of years. One of the original theorists of what today we call international law was a European statesman by the name of Emmer de Vattel. Vattel is quoted all the time by international legal theorists.
I quote him all the time. I bring him up often.
Well, he's a brilliant man. Actually, no, Anthony Scalia actually was quite fond of quoting Vattel in some of his more immigration-minded decisions, including his 2012 case, Arizona versus U.S. And Vattel talks all the time about how there is no such thing as a sovereign entity without the ability to exclude. And a logical corollary of that is that there is no such thing as a sovereign entity without the ability then to kick out people who you no longer actually want to be here. The only question is how you actually go about doing that. Now, there are a lot of cases. There are a lot of 19th century cases, even some 20th century cases that really do, broadly speaking, stand for the proposition that there is not necessarily a constitutional right to full, unequivocal due process if you are an alien, legal or illegal, and we the people want to kick you out of the country. I'll give you just one instance here. There is a 1953 case called Shaughnessy. It's an immigration case. And there was, I think it was a dissenting opinion, if I remember correctly, from Justice Robert Jackson, a brilliant 20th century justice. He actually ends up being the chief prosecutor against the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. So he was a fantastic legal mind. Funny aside, actually, that same Justice Robert Jackson was the lead dissenter in the 1944 case called Korematsu. That was the Japanese internment case during FDR World War II. And because he dissented on that case on due process grounds, Sean, he was known as this great champion of due process. Well, bear that in mind, because 9 years later, in this case called Shaughnessy, Justice Robert Jackson very clearly says that due process does not entail a right for anyone throughout the world to come here against our will, or once you are here, to remain here against our will. The only question then is what specifically then has to happen in order to get that alien legal or illegal removed. Now, here's where this ends up being something of a semantic debate where this kind of false dichotomy emerges there. Some people say, oh, no due process or full due process. In reality, it's oftentimes, as the case is, somewhere in this kind of gray area, murky middle. At a bare minimum, what would be required? The barest to bare minimum would be what lawyers call habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is essentially the ability of someone, legal or illegal, to just show some paperwork to make sure that you've got the right person. That's essentially what habeas corpus is. It was known as the great writ at English common law. It's about as basic as it gets. So from my vantage point, that is all that is truly, strictly constitutionally required. If you are trying to deport an alien, legal or illegal, is a quick in and out habeas corpus hearing to literally make sure you have the right person. That does not have to happen, by the way, in an Article 3 federal court. The way that immigration law is currently structured is that the so-called immigration courts are actually within Article 2. They're actually within the executive branch. So they're not happening in kind of the Northern District, Texas federal judge. That's not how it works. This is happening in the bowels of the immigration bureaucracy that's part of the executive branch, because that's how Congress drafted it as part of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 there. So in my judgment, a habeas corpus proceeding from an administrative law judge in that context would suffice there. Beyond that, if Congress wants to legislate additional protections, additional due process, if Congress wanted to make sure that every alien had their day in Article 3 federal court, they could do that. In my opinion, horrible idea. I don't know why in the world you would want to do that, and Congress thankfully has not done that. But the point is that Congress could legislate above the constitutional minimum baseline if they wanted to, but as a baseline matter, it's essentially a quick in and out habeas corpus proceeding. Make sure you got the right person, and that's basically it.
Okay, so but let me just start with this. My premise that there's three buckets, is that a smart or a accurate representation of how it is, or do you think that it collapses further, that like because the Constitution says persons, that it's anybody?
I view it more frankly as kind of a divide between citizen or alien. In my mind, there's actually not a massive distinction really between legal alien or illegal alien for purposes of so-called due process and removal. Okay,
so then let's talk actual people, because the courts are now ruling that the president has to bring back these people who were deported, and that they weren't afforded due process. So do these folks who aren't citizens, who came into the country illegally, have a right to come back and plead their case?
No, once you're literally out of the country, you certainly have no right to come back in here. So let me take this a little further. And this kind of touches on the whole Article 3 point about federal courts. There's another doctrine in immigration law that's worth mentioning here. And it's what lawyers refer to as the plenary power doctrine of immigration law. Plenary just means absolute power. What does that mean? What it means is that for 200 plus years, the Supreme Court consistently held that the two political branches, the Congress and the executive branch, have full plenary absolute power to enforce this nation's immigration laws. In fact, Sean, the first time that the United States Supreme Court ever invalidated an immigration enforcement statute, I'm going to blow your mind here. The very first time this ever happened was during the first Trump term in 2018, a case called Sessions versus DiMaia, a 5-4 case finding an immigration enforcement provision to be unconstitutionally void for vagueness. It was wrongly decided, in my opinion, but neither here nor there. The point is that for a very, very long time, the courts stayed the heck out of the way. In fact, you could actually make a pretty compelling argument that, properly speaking, there's no such thing as Article 3 judicial review when it comes to immigration enforcement decisions. Now, again, Congress could probably get around that by affirmatively legislating that if they wanted to. They've never done that, but in theory, they probably could. But the courts really, really, really do not get involved in these sort of decisions.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.